Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. Much of the medical establishment keeps on insisting that animal research is vital to develop new cures and treatments. They say the only way to find a solution to diseases like cancer and HIV is by medical experimentation on animals. But increasingly, there are a growing number of scientists who dispute this. They argue that animal physiology and human physiology is so different that you cannot simply generalize findings in animals and apply them to humans. They point to terrible disasters like the drugs Opren and Eraldin, which were safety tested on animals and approved for human use, and which resulted in many hundreds and thousands of injuries and even deaths. With me to discuss the whole issue of the scientific flaws of animal-based research is Dr Gill Langley, the scientific director of the Dr Hadwen Trust for Humane Research. Greetings, Gill.
Hello.
Dr Hadwen not only promotes non-animal methods and argues against animal-based research, but actively funds it. Would you like to just talk a little bit about the work you do and about perhaps a couple of examples of successful non-animal research that you've pioneered?
Yes, the Dr Hadwen Trust is the UK's leading medical research charity that uniquely funds non-animal research. We believe that that's to the benefit of humans and animals. We've been doing that kind of work for 37 years, which means what we do is we provide research grants to mainstream scientists in universities and hospitals around the country for research projects that aim to advance medical progress and thus help people, but to do it without any use of animals at all, and to do it with a technique which has the potential to replace animal experiments more widely. So our research program is very wide in terms of topics, ranging from, at the moment we're funding asthma research, research into breast cancer and brain tumours, into wound healing problems, into neurological problems. We go across the medical field. And we use non-animal techniques like computer simulations, cell culture studies, human volunteer studies when those are safe and ethical, and test tube methods in order to do away with the animal experiment side of things. One of our successes, one of our earlier successes, was developing a technique for miniaturizing the use of human cancer cells in the test tube in order to screen drug molecules to see whether they might make effective anti-cancer drugs. That kind of thing used to be done a lot in animals, implanted with tumours, but our technique enabled it to be done very quickly, very cost-effectively, using a very small number of human cells in the test tube to see if those drug molecules tackled the genes within those cells, which is the way they might work in the human body if they were tackling, destroying cancer cells. So that was a good breakthrough for us.
So in essence, your argument is that so many diseases are uniquely human. The best way to study them and find the cures is by looking at human cells and human organs, human tissues.
Yes. It's absolutely correct to say that most human diseases are uniquely human, especially if you compare them with the kinds of animals used in laboratories. Most of the animals used in laboratories are rats and mice, and they are chosen not because they resemble us most closely, because obviously they don't, but because they're cheap and quick and easy to use and they reproduce, and that makes them a cost-effective approach for scientists. The fact that they are living creatures doesn't enter into some people's realm of concern. But the problem scientifically with using other animals is that while clearly there are similarities between humans and other animals, there are also many differences. And these can be at the level of the organs in the body, which may have different structures. They can be at the level of the tissues or the cells. There can be molecular differences between the species. There can be differences in the way the circulation works or the nervous system. And so when you do an experiment on an animal, you can never know for sure whether that will predict what's going to happen in people. And oftentimes it doesn't. And that is a really serious problem.
Can you give some examples of sometimes when transferring data from animals to humans has led to some big screw-ups?
Yes. The most recent example that people may remember is the clinical trial at Northwick Park, where the volunteers who were volunteering for the first human taking of the drug TGN-1412 were nearly killed by its toxicity, which had not been predicted by any animal experiments, including experiments on monkeys. That's a particular and extreme case of a general problem, and in fact the world's largest drug regulatory agency, the American Food and Drug Administration, has concluded that 92% of all the drugs that pass animal tests are either ineffective or toxic in humans, which means that the drug industry is working with the animal experiment system has only an 8% overall success rate, which is just catastrophic. It's catastrophic for animals' lives, and it's catastrophic for people too.
Yeah, I mean, it's very sad, but when you think of the billions that have been spent on cancer research, and although we have made some progress, still, you know, that progress has been pretty small.
Yes.
And still people, many, many millions of people are dying of cancer.
Yes.
And it does seem that a lot of that research is animal-focused.
Yes.
And therefore, the results are not really transferable to humans.
Yes, that's right. And although that is true of cancer research, it's also true of any number of other human illnesses for which we don't have cures. It's true for research into stroke. Stroke research uses rats and monkeys, and just recently the 114th anti-stroke drug that passed animal tests went into clinical trials and failed. It's true of septic shock research, it's true of multiple sclerosis research, research into epilepsy. I think all those areas are areas where medical progress is being held back because people are putting too much emphasis on misleading animal models.
So basically what you're saying is that, you know, overall animal-based research is, leaving aside the ethical questions,
Sure.
It's just bad science.
It's not the best science we can do. The advantage of non-animal research techniques, the sort of things I mentioned earlier, like the cell cultures and the molecular studies and the use of volunteers in safe research, the advantage of those is they all use human-related materials, human cells, computer simulations of human systems, and that is the way to get the right approach, because if you're studying the right species, you're more likely to get the right answer. Another problem we haven't touched on yet with animal experiments is because most laboratory animals don't naturally develop our diseases, when scientists research those diseases in animals, they create them artificially. And the diseases they create artificially in animals are not duplicates of what you see in humans. So when they study strokes in animals, they create the stroke deliberately and surgically, and it is not the same as a human stroke. So all the time scientists are trying to use animals to understand human illnesses. They are creating conditions that don't duplicate the human condition and don't shed any light on the causes of the human condition because they're created artificially. And quite often we don't know the cause. We don't know the cause of multiple sclerosis. And yet research is being done on animals who have a kind of condition a bit similar to multiple sclerosis created in them, but that will never shed any light on the causes of multiple sclerosis. And that's true for a wide range of medical problems.
What's been the response of the pharmaceutical industry? Because hearing the logic of what you're saying and the scientific grounding of what you're saying, it would seem that it would make sense for the pharmaceutical industry to shift towards non-animal models and put the money into replacement techniques.
Yes. Up to a point, the drug industry has been doing that. Of all the research sectors, I think the commercial sector, the drug industry and related industries, have their eye on the main chance, are more likely to consider new technologies if they feel that they're going to be cost effective.
So you're suggesting this is quite market-driven, cost-driven and market-driven?
Yes,
yeah.
which reflects the value of these new non-animal replacement methods, because industry wouldn't be starting to embrace them if they didn't feel they worked. And in the drug industry, although in Britain the drug industry still uses something like 600,000 animal experiments every year, they have been reducing the numbers that they use. And they've been doing that by increasingly using cell cultures and computer modelling of drug molecules to see how they might act in the body. So the drug industry is coming round increasingly to non-animal research techniques, but I think the barrier that they see is that trying to develop a new technique is speculative. It might not work, and so there's perhaps a reluctance to invest as much funding in that as should be invested. Isn't
there also an obstacle in the sense that there is a requirement for new drugs to be tested on animals?
Yes, there you're referring to the regulatory agencies, both in this country, in Europe and around the world, who insist that some animal testing is done. So there has been considerable inertia in those regulatory agencies who seem to be happy to plough on with the same animal tests that were being conducted 60, 80 and in some cases nearly 100 years ago. So some of these animal tests are incredibly outdated. And I even read about a very high-up person in the American Food and Drug Administration who said, basically, we're doing the same drug testing that we did in animals 80 years ago, put the drug in them, kill them and cut them up and see what happens. That's not 21st century science. So there has to be a shift to the more advanced non-animal methods.
In other words, really, one of the things that's holding back the development of replacement methods are these regulatory requirements.
Yes.
And I've heard myself, scientific advisors for pharmaceutical companies saying, well,
yes,
we would love to move to non-animal tests,
yes,
because they're more efficient, more cost-effective,
yes,
but we've got this barrier that says these drugs have to be tested on animals.
Yes, although if you listen to the drug companies and you listen to the regulatory agencies, they usually blame each other. So the regulatory agencies say, oh, well, we would be very interested to look at data from non-animal tests, but the drug companies don't provide enough of it. And then the drug companies say, but the regulatory agencies won't accept our non-animal data. So there's a bit of circularity there and clearly some inertia that needs to be overcome. And if only governments would give a lead, then I think that circle, that little vicious circle of blaming each other could be broken out of.
And why don't you think the government is giving a lead?
I think the government has completely lost its way on the whole issue of animal experiments. There's a policy vacuum at the centre of their engagement with the issue, and there's no leadership at all. The funding that this government puts towards developing non-animal methods is embarrassing in international terms, and some other countries like Germany and Switzerland are way ahead of us on this.
What about the European Union?
The European Union is coming round to the idea, and I think at the level of Europe we might actually be on a bit of a cusp scientifically. The Commission of the European Union has funded a number of international research projects, getting scientists together from different countries with different expertises to try and find ways to develop new tests for drugs and for chemicals that don't use animals. So I'm quite encouraged that the European Union is starting not only to speak the right language and to acknowledge that non-animal testing is advanced testing that's more cost-effective and reliable, but they're actually putting their money more where their mouths are.
I think, remember we sat down with the Medical Research Council a few years ago to try and encourage them to develop replacement methods. This resulted I had a big debate with Professor Colin Blakemore, who is a very strong advocate of animal research. And I said to him, look, you say that you want to move towards reducing animal research and experimentation. Why doesn't the Medical Research Council put its money where your mouth is and actually start funding it?
Yes.
And we sat there up in Marylebone Road for those meetings time after time. They just got nowhere because it just strikes me that the establishment orthodoxy about animal research is so strong that even a body like the Medical Research Council, where there are some people who seem to be saying that things need to change, when it comes really to the crunch, they just not putting the money
No.
into funding the alternatives.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, the Medical Research Council is one of several research councils that are funded by the government that ought to be putting big money into this, that aren't. But there are other large charities, like the Wellcome Trust, who say they support the replacement of animal experiments, but they're not funding it. So there is a huge funding problem, but there is also a massive conservatism in the scientific community. I think lay people imagine that researchers are terrifically forward-looking and progressive and always after the next new thing, but actually when you meet scientists you realise they like to stick with what works quite often. And if
or what's accepted.
Well, yes,
what,
yes,
what
of course.
Their peers accept.
What seems to work for them, what gets them publications in scientific journals, what makes their name, what increases their status, working in that way, not working scientifically, because we've already talked about those problems. So they tend to stick with what they know, and it's incredibly hard to get them to take seriously the notion that they should be shifting away to different techniques, doing things in a different way.
I suppose the pharmaceutical companies also use animal research as an alibi. It's like, well, we've done the research on the animals, so therefore if things go wrong, they can always say, well, look, you know, we did the research on the animals, but all was fine, you know, don't blame us.
Yes, they feel that as long as they follow the rules that the regulatory agencies give them, then it can't really be their fault. And that, again, is that same circular argument with the regulators saying, do these tests, many of which are on animals, and then you can do your clinical trials in people, and the drug companies feeling that if they follow that step by step, they won't be liable for problems that happen further down the line.
In terms of future replacement and alternative technologies, I mean, what are the areas that you're looking at or hopeful about?
There are lots of fantastic new technologies coming on stream. There are terrific new ways of studying the human brain without, not only without causing any harm to volunteers for those sorts of studies, but without any kind of invasive approach. So there are imaging techniques that can look at not only
how do they work? How does it
some of them pick up the electrical activity of the brain, some of them measure the magnetic activity, but they all work by having a machine outside the human head, and can find out not only which bit of the brain is working when something is functioning, like if you see well, which part of your brain is working, if you have visual difficulties, which part isn't working, but they can now, with a really brand new technique called diffusion tensor imaging, they can actually trace the circuits in the brain which show how different areas are connected up, and they can do all this in the human brain without even touching the skull almost, which is a fantastic breakthrough, because all those kinds of experiments have traditionally been done in monkeys who've been strapped into restraint chairs and had electrodes put into their brains. So that is a tremendous breakthrough. There's also some wonderful new developments in terms of computer simulation, where you can do virtual experiments on a computer that don't require you to have any of a drug. You don't have to have synthesized your new drug even. You just can have a look at the molecule as an image on the screen and see how it might react in different parts of the body. So there's lots of exciting new developments there as well.
So you're also alluding to the new generation of virtual reality supercomputers, which can actually model whole organs, even whole parts of the body.
Yes, that's an up-and-coming area, and the supercomputers are absolutely crucial to that sort of work. And there's also some exciting developments in cell culture, because cells have usually been grown in very simple test tube circumstances where they don't really resemble the way they grow in the body, but increasingly scientists are finding ways to almost like make mini cellular organs in the test tube that much more resemble what happens in the human body. So they're combining different cells together and recreating structures that you would find in the human body, and then being able to do experiments on those in the test tube.
Now, I'm always struck looking back at the history of the development of the new generation of protease inhibitor drugs to make HIV a chronic but manageable illness. I recall the work of Merck Sharp and Dohme in the late 80s, early 90s. I had a big debate with one of the vice presidents there, and he admitted that this new generation of life-saving drugs developed by his company was developed using computer modelling.
Yes.
The whole drug
Yes.
was worked out using computer modelling. He said without any need
Yes.
for animal research at all.
Yes.
He said, well, they had to go to animal research in the end to meet the regulatory requirements, and the tragedy was that when they tested the first generation of these drugs on dogs and rats, they all died. And so they made the assumption that they would have the same, the drug would have the same negative effect on humans, and shelved it. And
Yes.
shelved it indeed for four years. A lot of the research was held back for 4 years before they developed a new protease inhibitor that didn't have that side effect. But of course, we don't know. Maybe that the drug they shelved back in 1989 may have actually not had that side effect in humans,
Yes.
and could have already, 4 years earlier, begun to save lives.
Yes,
So
yes.
it is a very vexed
Yes.
area, and
It is.
to get a major company like that to acknowledge that they developed this hugely important life-saving drug on computers without
Yes.
animal research.
Yes.
That's a fantastic
Yes, it is.
acknowledgement of
Yes.
the potential of these alternative technologies.
And it's also an acknowledgement that there were no effective animal models in which to test those protease inhibitor drugs, which, as you say, were developed using computer modelling, were tested on cells in the test tube, and then, because there were no good animal models for AIDS, and still are no good animal models for AIDS, the drug company was happy to accept that those drugs were effective on that basis. So if that can work for HIV drugs, it should be able to work with every kind of drug. And we just need to break through that mindset that says we've always done things this way, we're nervous about doing things a new way. Because, as you say, patients' lives are being lost, with 92% of drugs passing animal tests failing in human trials. It's an appalling situation.
How are things developing in terms of setting up, like, cell banks, tissue banks, organ banks, which can be used by researchers? How is that kind of alternative approach progressing?
Not too well. A lot of scientists tell us at the Dr Hadwen Trust that they would prefer to use human tissues, donated human tissues, if they could, but because they can't get reliable supplies of human tissues, then they revert either to using animal tissues or animals. The problem is that there is no national infrastructure for gathering donated human tissues for research as opposed to transplant, and then distributing those to the scientists when they need them. There is a national tissue bank, and it does its best, but it doesn't have full national coverage. And without a system of collection and distribution, scientists are saying we are having to fall back on using animal tissues, and a lot of them aren't that happy about it. And again, this is somewhere where the government could step in. Perhaps the Department of Health could do something. We have a system for gathering and distributing tissues for transplant. It shouldn't be that difficult to do something similar for tissue donation for research. But again, that has stalled, and the progress hasn't been that good.
Would that partly involve people donating their bodies to science on their death?
That's one part of it. There are small tissue banks, especially here in London, where, for example, people can donate their brains after they've died, brain banks, but they only operate at a very local level. So what we need are tissue banks that can distribute tissues post-mortem, but also there's a lot of surplus tissue available from living people.
From surgery?
From surgery, from people who have biopsies, and most of that tissue is thrown away, from people who have breast reductions or whatever. So there should also be a system to be able to gather those tissues, because what scientists need are tissues from people with medical conditions, but they also need tissues from normal, healthy people to act as a control. So there's a shortage of tissue donation. A lot of people are unaware that it is possible to donate their tissues for research purposes, and there's a lack of infrastructure to make those tissues available.
Perhaps could you give us another example of the positive and successful research that Dr Hadwen Trust has helped fund and support?
Yes, one of our more recent research projects was to give a research grant to the Public Health Laboratory, which is the government agency in charge of understanding what epidemics are going around the country, things like food poisoning outbreaks, The public health laboratory's job there is to say, okay, there's an outbreak of food poisoning. What is the bug causing that food poisoning so that we know how to treat it? And their standard practice for identifying many of those bugs that cause epidemics was to use animal experiments to identify them. And we helped them develop a technique based entirely on spectral patterns, which means that the bugs can be identified without any use of animals by shining a laser light at the bugs and then measuring the patterns that come off. And each pattern is unique to each bug, which means that the public health laboratory can now identify many bacteria that cause disease and death in people without using any animal tests at all. And their use of animals overall is declining markedly as a result.
Sounds so commonsensical.
It's great. It's absolutely great.
You mentioned that the pharmaceutical companies are reducing.
Yes.
Because they're finding that the alternative technologies, not using animals, are cheaper, faster, more cost-effective.
Yes.
So who is actually still doing all this, the main body of animal research?
Yeah. 2/3 of the experiments done on animals in this country, well, just under 2/3, are done by academics in universities and in medical schools. And they are also doing a lot of the genetic modification of animals, which is contributing to the fact that each year the number of animal experiments in this country is starting to rise now. After years of a decline, the numbers of experiments are starting to go up again. And this is partly to do with this genetic modification bandwagon, where scientists in universities think that if they tweak the gene of a mouse, they're going to be able to create a wonderful new model of a human disease without seeming to understand that a mouse is still a mouse even if it's got one human gene in it, that one human gene is operating in an entirely mouse body, that the results are not going to be any more reliable than the old-fashioned kind of animal experiment. And yet, because that was funded so strongly by the government and by the big medical research charities, there was money for genetic modification, and everybody jumped on the bandwagon, and the numbers of animal experiments have started to rise, partly because of that. So that's been a big problem area. And the Dr Hadwen Trust is now focusing on that area because there are some new techniques that enable human cells in the test tube to be genetically modified in similar ways to the ways that can be done with animals. Only obviously if you can genetically modify human cells, you can get a much better result for humans. So we're funding the development of those techniques.
So it's back to the old point of, to understand and cure human diseases,
yes,
you need to study human bodies,
you
tissues,
do.
cultures, cells.
You do, and especially human tissues and cells taken from people who have suffered from those illnesses that you want to study. So you're not creating an artificial illness like people do in animals. They're not saying, well, we're going to create diabetes in this animal by destroying its pancreas and then study that. They're taking cells from diabetics and studying those in the test tube with the new technologies. So you have the real illness, you have the human species, and it's not causing any animals to suffer. It's a win-win solution.
It does seem that the work you're doing really is pioneering and trailblazing the future of medical science. And what I find so extraordinary is that you're doing so much on so little. With small grants, you are achieving really important new breakthroughs in new technologies, which are having a big impact on human health and saving people's lives. So on that point, I think I'd like to thank you, Dr Gill Langley, for joining me today. I think it's been really very illuminating, and your work is really important. And to everyone who supports the Dr Hadwen Trust, thank you. And to those of you who don't, I hope you will consider giving a donation to the Dr Hadwen Trust to support their important work. Please join me next week for another edition of Talking with Tatchell.